Hey everyone, my name is Nikhil. So since last few days, I was researching for a Node.js series and I posted that out on the YouTube community post as well. So now I decided to put some content on the Node.js on this channel. And this is the first video on that. And in this video, we'll be creating a backend project. And in this backend project, you will master the Node.js with building the REST API, with using the MySQL database, and with using the Docker. So we'll be using the Node.js Express for API development, for developing the REST API, and we're gonna use the MySQL in a Docker container. So it is similar to microservices project. So we'll be using the Docker image of MySQL, and we'll also use the Docker volumes for the data persistent even when the containers shut down. So this will be an amazing project for anyone who wants to learn the Node.js building the REST API with MySQL database. Or if you have any experience with Munstack as well with using the MongoDB database, then it's also new learning for you. So like integrating the Node.js with the MySQL. So without wasting much time, let's dive into the project. And again, if you are new to my channel, then please subscribe to our channel as well, because we put a lot of videos on the full stack development, whether that's a backend, front end, or with the DevOps as well. So with that said, let's get started into this video. Hey everyone, and let's get started building an API with using the MySQL and the Docker. So let's get started with that. So you need to install the Node.js in your system. You can use this link, like we have the nodejs.org, which is the official website of the Node.js, and we'll be needing the MySQL Docker image as well. So if you want to install the MySQL locally in your system, you can just download the DB of the MySQL in your system, or you can use any cloud service of MySQL. But here I'm gonna be using the Docker version of MySQL. It is completely free to use. And we'll be using the package of the MySQL 2, which allows us to work with the SQL databases. So let's get started with this application. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna create a new folder that could be, we can have the CRUD. And in there, what we're gonna do, so we can open a new terminal, and inside the new terminal, we can move on to CRUD. And here, what we gonna do is we need to move on and we need to execute a script to create a new Node.js application. So it would be very simple. So what we need to do, so we have the npm, which is a node package manager, which comes by default when you install the Node.js in your system. So you need to run the npm, then we can have the init, then we can have --y flag. Because if you run the npm init, it will ask you a couple of questions. So if you want to bypass that, we can have double dash, then we can have the y. It will bypass all of the questions, then it will automatically write all of these things. So if we move on to package.json, here we have the test command, here we have license details, here we have the main file, and the package name is CRUD, the version is 1.0.2. And now let's move on, let's install a couple of dependencies. So here in this application, we'll be using the MySQL 2. We have the MySQL 2, and there is another package, which is the main package of the MySQL. Like that, we have the MySQL, but it doesn't work with the current version of MySQL. So that is this package. So you can see the last published, it was around 4 years ago. So it's not actively maintained as well, and it doesn't work with the latest version of MySQL. And now you can see now we can work with MySQL 2, and the whole community is moving towards this version, the MySQL 2. You can see the amount of weekly downloads. It is increasing day by day. So let's get started with that. So what we're gonna do, we need to install the MySQL 2 inside our system, and we'll be needing the Express here. We'll be having the Express. So let's install that. And after that, we'll be needing a development dependency, which will be the nodemon to just restart our server. So we can have the npm install, then we can have -d, then we need to install the nodemon. So what nodemon does, so it actively looks for changes inside our application files. So if it finds any change inside our application, then it will restart the server without manually intervention. Right? So without just restarting the server manually, it does the work. So what we're gonna do, So you can see the main file that we have here is the index.js. So let's create that file as well. We have the index.js, and inside that, what we need to do, so it would be very basic thing. So suppose we run this application, like we have the hello like that. So we run the hello over there. So we can just execute the index.js while using the node as well. With the node index.js, it will work perfectly fine. Then we'll be seeing the hello. But we can also use a custom script for that. So we have also installed the nodemon for restarting the server automatically. So we can use a custom script for running this application. In the development mode, we have the dev, and in there we can just use the nodemon index.js like that. So with this, now you can see if we just execute this command, so to execute this dev command, we can just use the npm run, we can have the dev like that. So if we execute that, you can see now we are seeing the hello over there, right? And suppose if we change anything, like if we change the hello to the hello world, so let's see, once we save, you see the hello world is being printed here. So that's how the nodemon works. So it actively looks for the file changes, and whenever it finds if any of the files of our application changed, then it just restarts the entire server of our application. So that's great. Now let's add the final thing, which would be the start script, and this would be for the production start. So once we just complete this application, so this start would be running by the production. So for the production, we can use the normal node index.js only, right? So let's get started. So now we need to create the API with that, right? So we will be needing the express. So we can have the import express from, it should be equals to the express. And here you can see once we use the ES6 import, now the node will give you the errors, cannot use the import statement outside of a module. So here, so you can see here we need to define the type over there inside the package. We have the type, and you can see we can set to module. So with using the module with the type, the default is the CommonJS. So if you want to use the module with the type with that, so what it will does, so with the help of that, we can use the ES6 imports like that. So you can see once we just make any change inside this file, or if we restart this server, so you can see now we won't be seeing any error message within our terminal. So that's how it works. Now we have the express. So first let's create a very basic express API, right? So we can have the const application, the application that should be equals to the express. And if you don't know about the express, so express is built on the node HTTP module. So if you know about the HTTP module of the Node.js, like the HTTP module, sorry. So HTTP of the Node.js. So the express is built on top of the HTTP module of the Node.js. So HTTP module allows us to create a web server, right? It allows us to create the web server. So we can set custom headers to that. We can do all these things. So express is built on top of that by extending the functionalities of writing custom API endpoints and all these things, and mainly adding the middleware system to that. So that's why we can use the express, just because of mainly the middleware system, so that we can have multiple authentication steps and the cleaner code as compared to the HTTP. So let's get started again. So here we have the const application equals to express, and then we can just have the app dot, we have the listen, and then we can define a custom port to that. So we can define a custom port that could be, suppose here we can have the const port that should be equals to, we can use the environment variable. So we haven't defined the environment variable as of now, but we'll define it later. So we can have the process dot environment dot, we have the port. So it uses the global process like the Node.js process, connect Node.js process dot environment variables dot, we have the port. And if we don't have that variable available, then we can just use the 5000 for the default port, and that's why we can use that. So we can just have the port, and inside the callback, so once the application would be listening at the port of 5000 or any port, then this callback would be fired. So after that, once the application would be listening, then we can have a normal log statement. So we can have the server open at, we have the port, then we can define the port over there. The port could be, we can have like the port directly coming from the port. And once we save, you can see now the server open at port of 5000. So it's great, right? That's great. So you can see now the basic server has been created. Now we can create the endpoints for the REST API. So before doing this tutorial, so you must have the basic understanding of the REST API and the HTTP things, like the HTTP request, the headers, the body data, and the REST API endpoints, like creating the GET request, creating the POST request, and all these things. So you also gonna need another tool, which is the Postman over there. So you need the Postman, which is the API client to test your APIs and to make the particular request to any API in the world. So here we have the app equals to express, and here let's define a custom route over there. That could be app dot, we have the get, and in there we can define a route. So once we use the get, it means we are using a get request, right? So if we use the get request at the slash point, then inside the second parameter, so once any client makes a request to this URL of our web server, then a callback would be fired, which contains the details of the request, like the details of the request, what client has requested you, all these details will be inside the request. Then we have the response. So response is used to send the custom response to the client. So we have the response. Then we have another thing, which is a next. So next is used for moving on to next middleware. So if we move on, so basically how the things work. So you can see, suppose this is the function, right? This is the callback function. So whenever any request, whenever any incoming request, this is the request. So whenever any incoming request comes into our server, so these functions gets executed. So these are the middleware functions which gets executed inside our application, right? These are the middleware functions. We can add as many middlewares as we want. So middlewares are just functions. So what the Express will do, so Express basically comes with the functionality of moving on to multiple middlewares, right? To moving on to multiple functions, basically. So with using the next, what do we have? So once we use the next over there, so it moves on from one middleware function to another middleware function, like that. So that's how the Express works. So we can move on to next middleware functions with using the next module, the next function of the Express. So these are the middlewares, and that's how it works. And suppose inside this middleware function, right? Inside this middleware functions, we write some details, like we have the details of, suppose, the DB operations, right? The DB operations. And inside the next middleware, we can have the details like, suppose any of the DB operation failed, right? If any of the DB operation failed, we can initialize another middleware for just like customizing or for just handling the errors. So this could be the error handler, right? This could be the error handler, and we can use another middleware like that. That could be for like just exiting the node process, right? Exiting node process and all these things. And another middleware could be used for any other purposes, like reopening the process and all these things, for just forking the connection of the Node.js, or for just like creating the clusters and all these things, right? So these are the concept of the middlewares which are used to just execute one another, right? So probably that's, you can see now you understood with that. So here you can see that's a get request, and in there we can just log some details like that. We have the log, that could be, we can have the request dot, that could be the URL or method, some details like that, right? So if we open the Postman, So once we open the Postman, suppose here I'll just create a new collection for this. We have the new, that could be like we can have the collection with that. Sorry, we can have the new, then we can have like HTTP request over there. We can close all other request, right? We can close all other request, and here we can just use a new request again, like that. So we have the get request, and in there we can provide like the details of the HTTP localhost, because we are currently working with the localhost. Then we have the 5000. So it means we are making the request to slash endpoint, which means nothing after the domain. So once we hit on the send, you can see we have the sending a request. So now it will just create a connection, mainly a TCP connection with our server. Then you can see now we are receiving the request dot method property. With that, we have the get request. And suppose we want to send some response as well. So we can have the response dot, we have the send, and in there we can send any response to the client. So whenever any client request to this, like request to this URL, so we get the details of the request and the response that we want to send, and we can send the response to that client. Suppose we send the hi with that, so we'll be receiving the hi over there. Suppose if we use that, you can see now we are receiving the hi inside the HTML. So we can also use the h1 tag as well. We have the h1 tag, then we can have inside the h1, we can just send the hello, something like that. So you can see now, if we again make the request, you can see now we are seeing the HTML. That could be the hi, that could be the hello, like that. So that's how everything works. So that's a very basic, like the HTTP request. And the final request that I want to show you inside this, like the very basic demo, that could be the post request. So inside the post request, we would be needing to send some body data. That could be the body raw data, that could be the JSON data, or any data that we want. We can send the form data as well, URL encoded data as well, and all these things. But mainly we'll be working with the JSON data. So in there we have the request dot, you can see now we have the request, but while sending the post request, inside the post request, we can attach some data. So inside the get, we cannot attach any data with the request, but with using the post HTTP method, we can attach some data. So we can listen to that request as well. So we can have the app dot, we can have the get like that. And suppose that is on the same URL, the same path. Then inside that, again, we can have the normal request response and the next over there. Then in there, now what do we have? So we can log the method. We have the request dot method, and in there we can just like, you can see we have the post request. So that should be the post. We have the app dot post. We have the similar request. Then we can log the method of the request, and then we can send some response. Like we have the response dot, we have here this send like that. That is like the post, something like that. So if we make the request to 5000 again, if we click on the send, you can see we are receiving the post method, and here as well we are having the request dot method, that is the post. But how can we get some data? Suppose we send some JSON data like this, like my name, that could be, we can have the Nikhil, something like that. So how this data can be visible inside a server? How we can send this data inside the body? So like this, we can send, but how we can just receive that data? So for that, we need to just tell this application that will be working with the JSON data, right? So we'll be working with the JSON type data. So we want to tell to this application, we want to instruct this application to parse any incoming data to the JSON. So we can just have like the app.use. So app.use is used for like attaching the middlewares. So before even going to this request, like before even going to app.get, app.post, we can use the app.use, which will be above of this request, which will parse the incoming data to the JSON. So how it will parse, we can use the express dot, we have the JSON. So what it will do, so it will return a middleware that passes the JSON, right? That passes the JSON data. So with using that, now we can get the JSON data. It would be very easy. Like you can see, we have the request. So we are sending the data along with the request. So we should be receiving the request dot body. And once we move on, once we save, and if we just send this request, you can see now we are receiving the body data with that. You can see the same data that we are sending over this postman, over this client. We are receiving the same data over there, which is the name, which is the Nikhil. And thanks to this express.json. Because now you can see if we comment this code, now we won't be seeing any data. So if we click on the send, you can see now that is undefined. Right now that is undefined. So thanks to this express.json properties. So that's it for now. That's it for the very basic API with that. Now let's work on the main, like the SQL CRUD API with using the Node.js and Express. So let's get started with that. So let's just go through and create a new file. That could be like we can have the routes, or we can declare a new folder here. That could be we can have the routes. And in there, let's create a new file. That could be the index.js. And in this file, we'll be declaring all of the routes of our application. So here, what we're gonna do is we need to just create multiple routes, and we need to attach their handler functions, which will handle the incoming request made to a particular endpoint. So we can have the const, we can have something called router, and we need to use the router. So we can import, like we can have something from, that should be, we can have the express, and we need to import something called a router. So here we'll be declaring a router. That could be the const, like app router, that should be equals to the router itself. So here we have the router, and here we want to export this router as well as a default export. Right, as a default export, we'll be having the app router over there. Now this router will listen for the incoming request. Suppose we have the app router dot, we can have the get, and inside this, suppose we can have slash. It means now if we have the, like if we have some products in our database, that could be like if we make the request to slash endpoint, it means now we want to grab all of the products from our database. So we can have slash, and in there we'll be attaching a handler function. So for the handler function, let's create a new file over there. So inside the CRUD, we can create a new file. That could be, we can have something like handlers, like that. We have the handlers, and in there we can again have the index.js for handling the incoming request for that. So here we can have something called, we can have the import. Like here we would be needing to import some of the things, but as of now we can remove the import and we can just define the handler. Like we can have the get all products. So that should be equals to a function. That could be any async function over there. We can have the async function like that. And in there, we would be requiring the details, like we have the request response with that. So we have the request and the response for that. Then we can move on. Then we can have a couple of more functions like that. We have the get all products. Then we can have the get product. And in this, like what do we have? So if you want to get a product by its particular ID, we can use a get product. Then we can have something like we can have the create product, like that. We have the create product. So with the help of this, now we can create a new product. And in there, we can have the update product, something like that. Then finally, we can have the delete product, something like that. So we would be having these handler functions with us. And we need to export these handler functions as well. So we can export all of these handler functions with that. So we can add the export before all of these functions, like that. So we would be using these functions. So let's have the routing for that. We have the app.get, then we can have slash. It means now we can just attach this function of, we can have the get all products. So we can attach that particular function with that. Right, so we are attaching this function, and this function would be getting the request and the response from that. Similar thing we want to do with, we can have the app router dot get, and if we want to get a particular product by its ID, So we can provide the ID inside the URL. So we can have slash, we can have the parameter that could be the ID. So it means there could be any dynamic ID for an endpoint. So suppose our application is we have the API slash we can have the products, right? Sorry, we have the products like that. So in there we want to just return the list of the products with that. That's great. But here we can just have something like we can have the API, then we can have we have the products, then we can have any dynamic ID, 1, 2, 3, or any ID with that. So once we make the request, so we can have this like, so we have the API products, and then what we're gonna do, we have the API products. So if we have any dynamic ID after that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, so this handler function would be executed. So that's how it works. Now we have the ID, then we can attach the handler function, or we can have the get product. So similar to that, we can have another type of request. We can have the app router dot, in this case, we can have the post. So with the post, we can again use the same endpoint. Then we can have something like, or if we want to use a different endpoint, we can have the different as well. So we can have the create, then we can have here the create product. Then we can move on, we can have the app router dot, we can have the put. So put method is used for make any modifications inside the request or inside the DB. So that's why we use the put request over there. So inside the put, again, we need the particular ID of that product, right? We need the ID for the product which we want to update. And we'll be also needing the details, like what could be the updated details, right? So that would be the ID. So we can have something like we can have the update, then we can have slash ID, right? So that's how we want to work. Then we can just move on and we can just apply. So we can have the update product. Then final thing, what we want to do, we can have the app router dot delete. So here we can have the delete as well. Delete could be, we can have slash delete like that, slash any ID with that, any dynamic ID for deleting a particular product. So we can have the delete product with that. So you can see that's how we can define the routings over there. You can see these are the routings. So we have the get request, we have the get request for a dynamic ID, the post, the put, the delete. Now we can use this app router inside our main index.js file. So we can remove all these things. So let's make this application more readable, right? Let's make this more readable. So here we have the section of, suppose we can have the region that could be like, we can have the middlewares. We have the region of the middlewares. Then after that, we can have another middleware, and this middleware would be used for the routing operations. We can use a middleware for the routing operations. Suppose we want to listen to, suppose we want to have like the URL of our web server could be like, we can have domain slash, we can have the API slash v1, something like that. So we can define these details here, right? We can have the API slash, we can have the v1, right? Then we can have the product, something like that, right? So we can have the product, something like that. And we want to attach the app router to this. So once our application will make a request to API v1 product, something like that, so app router will listen to that. So that's how we want to work. And now we are getting an error because we need to use their .js as well. You can see we are using the type of module. So inside this type, we would need to import the full path of our file, including the extension, right? So same applies to this as well. So here, what do we have to do? So we need to use the handlers, then we have the index.js, right? So that's how we want to work with that. Now you can see now we have this middleware for the routing purposes, and you can see that's right. You can see now it should work. So suppose now we move on to get our products. So here, now what should we do? So we are having the response dot, suppose we can have this send. So here we can have something like hi, or we can have something like get all products with that. So we can have the return, something like that. We have the get all products. So now if we make a particular request to that endpoint, we have the 5000. Then if we move on to index.js, we have the API v1, then we can have the products. Then we can have the API v1 products. And after the products, now the app router will take over this request. Now the app router requires require this URL again after that. So after that, whatever URL we have inside the app router, so that should be appended here, right? So here you can see that is a default route. So here we don't need to just append anything. But if we are working with the create, then we need to append the create inside this URL, right? So that's how it works. Now we have the products. So that's a get request. So if we click on the send, so I think you can see there's double slash there. So if we hit on send again, so now we are receiving the get all products. So everything seems to be working perfectly fine. Now let's start working with the database, right? Now we'll be starting working with the database. So as I conveyed you earlier that you can use the MySQL, you can download the MySQL in your system. Just use the MySQL like that. Then you can just download the MySQL community version inside your system and use that. But if you don't want to download the MySQL, or if you want to use any cloud version of the MySQL, so like no worries, you can use the cloud version as well. But here inside my system, I'll be using the Docker. So here I'll be using the Docker here. So I'll be using the Docker over there. So Docker is a great thing, right? So it helps us to use any like software, any servers with that. So we can define all of them in a containers. So for that, we would need to create a new image for this MySQL. We need to pull this image basically. So here what we're gonna do, so here we can use the MySQL Docker with that. So we can have the MySQL Docker, and here that is the official MySQL image from the Docker. That's it. Now what do we wanna do? So we wanna run a container based on this MySQL image, right? So if you don't know about the Docker and all these things, I'm gonna give you the very basic example over there. So that is the Excel draw over there. So suppose you can see that is the Docker, right? That is the Docker. And in there, we create multiple images. That could be an image of the database. That could be the image of any service, like that could be Nginx. That could be new service for suppose MongoDB, MySQL database, and all these things. So these are the images. So images are like the classes, right? So these are like the classes. We call it the images. These are suppose like a class. So inside the class, inside the programming, we create the instances of the class, right? We create the instances. So it means we can create multiple instances of this image, right? We can create the multiple instances. But basically, if we deploy this application, we only use one instance. But suppose we have a Node server, suppose we have created a new image for a Node server, there it will be helpful if we create the multiple images to scale our application and all these things. So here, so you can see that is an image, and we can create multiple sub containers based on that image. We can create the containers based on this particular image. So we can have this as well. So here we can have another container like that. And here as well, we can have another container similar to that. So these things are the containers, right? So they are like isolated environments where our application runs. They provide you an environment similar to the VM, but it provides you a similar resources like the virtual machines where our applications are deployed. So there's a containers which have their own file system, which have their own isolated environments. And the major thing of the containers are, so if you want to use different version of MySQL for this container, so you can do that. If you want to use a different image for a MySQL, you can use a different container and all these things. So that's how it works, right? So that's how it works. So another advantage with the Docker is, so you can create multiple images. Suppose you want to use the earlier version of MySQL, like you can see you can use 8.0.37, 8.0. You can create the images based on that. You can run these images, and you can run any container based on that version of that image. So that's basically an overview like how the Docker works. So that's how it works. Now what do we want to do? So we want to pull this image from the Docker. So here, the very simple thing could be we can create a new terminal over there, the new terminal, and in there, so I will just zoom this terminal a bit. So I'm gonna remove that. Sorry, we're gonna remove that like that, and I'm gonna just move this as well, so we can have this. So here we can just run a particular command which will create a container based on MySQL. And if you don't have the MySQL image installed in your system, like if you don't have the MySQL image, like there you can see, even I don't have the MySQL image as of now. So what it will do, so first it will pull the image from the Docker, then it will create the container based on that. So here we can just have here the Docker. That could be we can have the run. So with the help of run command, we run a container. Then we can have dash D. So if we provide the dash D, it means like it would be, so this container will be in a detached mode. Otherwise, if we don't provide the dash D, so the Docker will take over the control from you for this terminal window. So that's how it works. Then we can have something like we can have the P. So P is used for the port mapping. So the default port of the MySQL is 3306, right? So if you just download the MySQL and you run inside your system, so the default port of MySQL is 3306. So what we're gonna use? So we can have the 3306. We wanna map the 3306 of our environment to 3306 of that image, right? So it is used for the port mapping. So 3306 for the Docker image and 3306 for our terminal. So that's how it works. Then what we're gonna do, so we can just have the RM over there. So it means when we stop this container, it means it will remove the container from the containers as well. So with the help of RM command, we can do that. Then after that, what we're gonna do, so inside the MySQL, we also need the volumes, right? We also need the volumes over there because we wanna persist the data, right? So suppose a container is shut down, so we wanna persist the data. So we can use something called, we can have the volume. So we can provide the volume like this. We can have dash V, and in there we can provide the name of this volume. We can have something like we can have the MySQL data, something like that. And in there, that is a named volume. It means the volume would be persisted across the container shutdown, and we can provide custom name and path for this volume. So we have the MySQL data, and after that, after the MySQL data, then we can have something like we can have where, or we can use something inside the lib. Then we can have the MySQL with that. So it means like that is the folder name. That is the name of the volume, like the MySQL data. And inside the volume, it will create the new path of the where, lib, and the MySQL. So inside the MySQL, this is the final folder where all of the data will be stored. Then now what we're gonna do, so now you can see what we have done. We have provided the Docker run, we have the D, we have, you can see we have the detach mode, we have the port mapping, we have the remove when container shut down, then we have the volume. Then MySQL needs something called environment variable. So we need to provide the environment variable. So we can do that with providing the dash E that is used for the environment. And the main environment variable which it needs is we have the MySQL. Like we have the MySQL, then we can have the root, then we can have the password. So that is the environment variable which the MySQL requires. So that is equals to any password. Suppose I'm going to give here the test, right? And now you can see now we have provided all of the details, right? We have provided the details of Docker run. We have dash D, we have dash P for the port mapping, remove the container, volume, and the environment variable as well. The final thing would be we want to provide the name of this image. You can see the name of this image is the MySQL. So now we want to provide the name, which is we can have the MySQL with that. And if we want to use the latest version, we can just have the MySQL latest, something like that. So you can see that is the command. So I'm going to copy this command as well. I will share you the command. So if you open the notepad over there, So if you open the notepad, I'm going to share you the command as well. So that is the command, the docker run. We have dash d, we have dash p, the port mapping, the remove and all these things. Then we are pulling the image of the MySQL. So image name comes at the last while we use the container. So now what will happen? So once we hit on that, you can see unable to find the image of MySQL latest locally. So now inside my Docker, we don't have the MySQL image. So what it will do now? So first it will download the image and it will just add the image inside the Docker, and then it will just allow us to use that image. So that's how it works. So after it downloads the image, then you can see the MySQL over there. You can see the MySQL here. Inside that, you can search for the MySQL and you will be seeing that over there. So that's how it works, and that's how you can see the Docker also works. So we need to wait until it is installed. So you can have a cup of tea or a coffee. So you can see now it is installed. So forget about the coffee. Let's complete the task first. So you can see now inside that, you can see now we have the MySQL over there, right? We have the MySQL, we have the tag of the latest, then we have the status in use. And the size was around 584.53 megabytes. So now you can see now we have this, and now you can see now the Docker has provided us the container ID. So that is a container ID. So you can see now the Docker run, once you use the Docker run, it gives you the container ID. That is the container ID. Now let's move on to containers. You can see now, I think we missed something inside the container, which is providing a custom name for that. So if you want to use the custom name as well. So first we gonna remove this container. So we can have the Docker stop this container ID. We have Docker stop this container ID. You can see once we do that, you can see now this container would be stopped. But inside the volumes, now we would be seeing the MySQL data, right? Because earlier we created a volume, right? We created a volume of the MySQL data. Now that volume is still present. Now let's rerun this command. Let's copy this command, and in there we want to provide a custom name for the container. We can do that with providing a dash dash. We can have the name. That could be any name of your choice. Like we can have the SQL DB, we have the SQL DB. That could be the name for that. So let's copy and let's paste it out here. So I'm going to clean that out. Let's paste this. Let's hit enter. And you can see now instantly, you can see now the MySQL image is already there inside our system. So now we have this container ID with that. Now you can see now the container name is SQL DB. And you can see it is running on the port of 3306. So the MySQL is installed, right? The MySQL is installed, and congratulations on that. So now if you want to interact with the SQL database, you can move on to execute, and in there you can interact with the SQL DB. But how can you use that? So for using that, you need a command which is the MySQL. Then we can have -u, right? So that is defined to you by the MySQL. It is not invented by me or any developer. It is provided to you by the MySQL. So here we can have the MySQL -u. Then you can see the default user of the MySQL is the root. So that is a root user. So we can have the root. Then we can have -p for the password. We can provide the -p for the password. And what password did we provide? That was a test. So without any space, you need to provide the password. That could be, we can have the test. And once you hit that, you can see now, you can say we are connected to MySQL, right? We are connected to MySQL over there. You can see the welcome to MySQL monitor and all these things. So MySQL is installed. So now we'll be connecting with the MySQL. So the very first thing that we want to do, so if you have already worked with the MySQL, it would be very easy. So we just need to create a new database. So we can have the create database. That could be like ecom, something like that. So suppose we are just having the CRUD operations for the e-commerce application that holds the products for now. We can have the create database, that could be the ecom. And once we do that, you can see now the ecom database would be created. Now, what do we want to do as the next step? Now we want to use the ecom. We can have the use the ecom database like that. And once we do that, so now we would be using the database of the ecom. So that's why we see the database changed, right? So that's why we see the database changed. And I think now it is more readable, right? Now I think it is more readable. And now what we gonna do? So now we can create a new SQL table, right? We can create a new table inside the SQL and it would be very easy. So what we're gonna do is use basically a normal create table, something like that. So we can just have the create, then we can have something like we can have the table, and the table name could be, we can have something like we can have the products, right? We can have the products. And after that, what do we want to do? We can add those round brackets over there. Now we can provide a couple of details for the table. That could be the ID for a particular product. And the ID would be, we can have the integer. So we can have the integer for the ID. We can have the int for that, the short form. Then what we gonna do? So after this ID int, then we can have something like, we can have like primary key. So the ID would be the primary key, and we want to auto increment the ID as well. We can have the auto increment, something like that. So this ID would be automatically created by the SQL database. Then after that, what do we want to do? We can add a comma with that. After that, now we want to provide the second column. That could be the title of the product. So the title could be like, we can provide the title inside the varchar, right? We can have the varchar that should be equals to something like, we can have the 32. So it can contain the character length up to 32, right? So 32 characters long, it could be the size for that. We have the title varchar 32, and we can have the not null check for that. So we can have it not, then we can have the null. It means the title is a required property. Then we can have something called, we can have the description, something like that. We have the description, and description is also, so you can see we have spelled it correctly, right? Description could be, again, we can have something like, we can have the varchar. The varchar could be here, that could be something like 255 with that. The variable length up to 255. So the character length up to the 255, that could be the description. It is also, we can have the not null, something like that. And the final thing for this application could be, we can have the price. The price, again, we can something called, we can have the integer with that. With the price, that could be the integer. And inside that, it could also be, we can have the not, we can have the null, something like that. And after that, now we want to close this bracket. So either we can hit enter and we can close this bracket like that. So that would be the command for creating that. So I'm going to use the notepad again. We can have the creating table. So that is a command for that, right? We have the create table products, ID, integer, primary key, auto increment. We have the title, the varchar 32, not null, the description, varchar 255, not null, the price is integer, not null. So that is the table. So let's hit enter and let's see what happens. If we hit enter, you can see the query just responded us with the OK, right? We have the query OK. It means now we'll be having this table, right? So if we run the command of the show tables, so if we run this command, you can see now the tables in e-commerce is, we have the products and we can show the description of the table. We can have the disk, that should be, we can have the table, something like that. So sorry. We have the descript. So we have the describe, that could be, we can have the product, something like that. So if we hit on that, you can see now it has provided us the description on the table of the products. So you can see that's how we can work with the Docker image of the MySQL, and that's how we can create multiple tables with that. The ID, the title. So that's all the way for the Docker and the MySQL image. So you can see now we have one table inside our database. So now we have the table inside our database. Now what we should do is, now we need to use the MySQL 2 package to connect with this MySQL database. Then we can perform the operations. Now, what should we do as the next step? So let's move on to our application. So let's again move it down. Let's again clear the terminal. Then let's move on. So let's create a new file. So inside the CRUD operations, we can create a new file that could be the DB. And in there, we can have the index.js. And we can have another file that could be, we can have the queries dot we have the JS, something like that. So inside the queries, now we would be providing the custom queries like selecting something from like selecting one record, selecting all records, right? Deleting one record, updating one record, creating one record. So this would be there inside the queries. Then we have the index.js. So here it will just like inside the index, we would be taking care of the connection and all these things, right? So that's how it works. Now we have already installed the MySQL 2 package, right? So here we wanna import that. So we can move on, we can close all the files, we can move on to index.js and we can import something from, we can have the MySQL 2. And here we would be using the connection, right? We have the create connection. So inside the create connection, it creates a new connection, right? Create connection creates a new connection every time we make a request to MySQL 2. But sometimes what happens, so sometimes there are multiple connections which are open, right? So I'm giving you the advice for that. So sometimes there are multiple connections which are open with the database. If you list the connections, you're gonna see that. So instead of the create connection, it is also majorly used, but you can also use something like pool. So what is the pool? It means if we have something like, I'm gonna delete that. So you can say, suppose a request was there with the Node.js server, which uses the connection. You can see that was one connection which was made. So with the help of pool, we can get this connection only to work with the MySQL database, right? So suppose that's a MySQL database over there, right? Suppose that's a MySQL database. So this pool can be used, only this pool can be used for working with the MySQL databases. But if you just use the create connection, so every time a new request in, so every time we have the new request, so a new connection object would be created, then that connection request would connect to the database. So that could be the issue with the memory and performance as well. So that's why we can use one single connection, or there can be multiple connections according to the memory. So it's up to you. So one single connection can use to work with the databases instead of creating multiple connections that are idle. So that's how it works. Now let's move on and let's work with the application again. So here what we're gonna do, we need to import something like create pool, right? The create pool would be there. And after that, let's create one single instance of the pool. So we can have the const, the pool, that should be equals to, we can just have the create pool. We have the create pool with that. And here we want to provide the details. So here we want to provide the details of our application. So the details related to the port of the system. On which port do we have? We have the running on, we have 3306, right? We have MySQL running on the port of 3306. You can verify from here. Then what do you want to do? We can just have the password for that. So what password do we have? We have the password like test. And make sure you have all these details inside the environment variable. So let's install a package which is, we have the .env. So with using that, we can use the environment variables. I think that is installed inside the root directory. My fault. So let's remove that. Let's delete. Let's move on to the CRUD and now install the .env. .env like that. So it will help us to use the environment variables. Now let's create a new file which is .env, right? .env. And so here we have the .env file, and in there, what we're gonna do, we can just have the MySQL password. So that could be the password of the MySQL. So in this case, we have the password of the test. So we can provide the same password, and we can also use the port number as well. For our application, we have the port that could be like 5000 for now. We have the 5000 for the port. And after that, the MySQL requires new things as well. So MySQL requires another thing, which is like we have the database name. So we can have something like MySQL database, something like that. Name, that could be the database name. So in this case, we have the e-commerce, right? For the database name. Then we can again use the host, so the MySQL, which is we can have the host. So that should be equals to something like, so currently we are working with the local host. So let's use the local host for now. Then the final thing could be we can have the MySQL user. That should be equals to we have the root. So by default, we have the root user. So we need to provide these details to this pool. So very simple. So first we want to move on to index.js and we want to import something. We want to import something that should be from the .env. We have the .env which we just installed. So we want to have the config. So we just need to call the config with that. So config will allow us, like it will just execute, and after that it will load the environment file from our application. So it will just load the environment file. Then we can just use the variables which we have defined. Now let's move on. So here we have the port, and inside the port we can just have, we can open this inside the side window, right? Now we can have the MySQL, like we have the port as well. We can define the port, and the port by default that we have is we have the 3306 for now. We have the MySQL port. So here now what do we have? So here we should use the process dot environment dot we have the MySQL port, right? We have the MySQL port like that. Then we can have here something like, you can see we have the password as well. The password would also be the same. We can use the process.environment. Then we can add the MySQL password like that. Then we can use here the host as well. We have the host. So here as well, it would be same. So we can add the process.env dot we have the MySQL host. And then we can move on. So now we should just have here the database. We can have the database like that. So that is again the process dot environment variable. Then we can just have the database name of the MySQL, the database name. Then final thing could be, I think we can just have the user. So what user do we have? So we have the MySQL user, which is a root. We can have the process dot environment dot we can have the MySQL user. So that's how it works, right? That's how it works. And if you want to print all these details as well, you can print all these details inside the, like once you start the server, you can print these details as well. Now we can just have a function that could be the async function. And in this function, what we can do, so we can have the const, we can have something like the connect to database. So we have the connect to database function. And in there now what we should do, that should be the async function. And in there, the very basic thing would be we can have the try catch block. So sometimes there could be the scenarios where the database is not available. So then what we want to do, we need to just have the await. Then we can have the pool dot we can just have here like the get connection, right? So we want to get the connection from the pool. So once we use the create pool, so new pool of connection would be created. Then if we get the connection from that, it means now it is working perfectly fine. And now we have the connection, right? If we have the get connection, it means we already have the connection and we can go ahead. Then we have the catch block as well. We have the catch block. And there, what should we do? We just have the log statement. We have the database connection error, something like that. And after that, let's move on and let's just log the error message as well, the error. Then we can throw this error as well. We can throw that error. So that's how it works. And another thing you can see, the MySQL 2 also provides you another thing, which is the promise. So if you want to use the promises with the MySQL 2, we can use the promises. And after that, we can just have the await statements. Or else you want to move on and you want to provide the callback functions with that to handle the errors and connections and all these things. So we can just have the promises with that to work with the latest JavaScript. So you can see the connect to database is working perfectly fine, and that's how it works. Now we can export this function. So we can export the connect to database as well, and we can export the pool as well, because the pool would be used to create a new query and all these things, right? So that's how the things would work. And here, once we have the get connection, we can again have the log statement. Then we can have the MySQL connection successful. Then we can have an emoji as well, like we can have the smile, something like that. And here we can use this emoji, something like that, or we can have the fingers like that. That could be like this, like the MySQL connection successful. Now let's move on to index.js. So here the very basic thing would be, now we would need to just connect to database, right? We need to connect to database. So you can see now, even before defining the middlewares, we can just have the connect to database. Or we can move on, we can have something like here. We can have the connect to database, something like that. We have the connect to database, and we are importing that from the dbindex.js. And once it would be connected, so we can have something like we can have the then. So then what we're gonna do, we wanna open this server, right? Then we wanna open this server. Then you can see we can have the catch block as well. So if we get an error, we have the catch, and in there now what we should do, we can log, like we can have the error occurred with MySQL connection again. Then we can log the error message as well. We can have the error equals to, we can have the error. And the final thing could be we can exit the node process, right? We can have the process dot, we can have the exit, because if our database is not connected, then there is no use for this API, and we should exit the Node.js process. The exit should be, we can have the 0, which is graceful shutdowning of this node process. So that's finally, now we have covered the connection as well, right? We have covered the connection. So it means you can see now we have the then statement. So once we see that, it means you can see the SQL connection is successful and everything seems to be fine. And if we see an error, we would be moving on and we can close the node process. So if we move on to there, you can see now, you can see the access denied and all these things. You can see now it means we have the access denied, and you can see the clean exit is there. So now the node process has been exited. So let's work with that as well, like error occurred with the MySQL connection, access denied for the user with that. Okay, so let's fix that as well. Now it is connected. So very basic modifications were needed. Only thing which needed was we needed to use the config before that. So earlier what were we doing? So first we were exporting the connect function. So the Node.js will move on to this file and then it will just use the process environment variables. But we were using the configuration after this app.use. So that's why initially all these variables were undefined. So that's why everything was like it was showing errors. But now you can see now I have these things. So if you move on to environment, you can see now my password is test. My name is ecom. We have the host of localhost. The user equals to root. The my port equals to 3306. And everything seems to be working perfectly fine. And here as well, you can see now we are throwing error if we encounter any error with that. So as of now, you can see it is working perfectly fine. So we don't have any issues and all these things. So you can see now our database is successfully connected and everything seems to be working perfectly fine. Now as the next step, now what do we need to do? So here we'll be creating the queries. So we can create the reusable functions, suppose for finding a product by its ID, for finding all the products, right? For updating the products. So we can define the queries here. So we can have the const, we can have the get, or we can have the find, something like that. So we can have the find all or something like that. So we can use the find normally. That should be equals to a function with that. So this will be an asynchronous function. We have the async function over there. Now inside the find, now what should we do? So you can see now we have the pool over there. We have the pool, so we can use the pool over there. Right? We have the pool. We are getting the connection from the pool. So here we can create the query with that. So we can get the connection from the pool, and we can execute that query inside the Docker, inside the MySQL. So we can have the const, we can have the query that should be equals to, we can have the select like that. We have the select that should be star from. So the table name is the products. So we can have the products like that. We have the products. We have the select star from products. And after that, now what should we do? So we can have the try catch block. So inside this, now very basic thing that we want to do is first we can get the client of the SQL. So we can get the SQL client. So we can use the pool from there again. So we can have the pool dot, we have the get connection. So with the help of that, now we would be getting the client of the SQL. Now what should we do as the next step? Now we can just have the client dot query. That should be the query. And here the query would be the normal SQL query with that. And that's it, right? That will be the query. And we can grab the result as well. So we can have the result that should be equals to, we have the client dot query, and we should use the await as well, because you know why? Because we are working with the promises, so we should wait for this task to complete. Then after that, once we receive the result, then we can return the result property itself. We can return the result property, and that's it. And if we get any error within that, then we can just log the error occurred. So we can have something like error occurred while suppose we can have the find, while finding all records. So we can have good trace over the error. Then we can move on. Then very simple thing would be, we can just have the error details over there. Then we can throw the error. We can throw the error, and that's it. Right? That's it. So that is a find. And let's execute this find. Let's export that and let's use the find over there. So inside the, you can see, suppose we move on, and if we just log the result as well, if we log the result, and we would be getting the details. And now let's move on to handlers. So here we can again have the try catch block for handling the errors. Here we can just have the const, we can have the products. So that should be equals to await. Then we can have the find, right? Then we can have the find. So then we would be getting the details. Then we can just have, like, we have the return response dot, we have the JSON. So here instead of just using the send, we can have the JSON. And inside the JSON, we can have the products. That should be equals to, we can have the products like that. So very simple with that. We have the queries.js we need to use. So very simple with that, right? So I think we got an error. Directory import like NodeSQL DB. So inside the queries, we would need to use here, like we have the index dot, that could be the JS for using that. Successful. So let's move on. So now let's move on. So here we have the response.json of the products. And if you want to provide the status as well of that, status could be 200, and that's how it works. And if we get any error, then again we can log the error over there. We can log the error details over there, and we can send the response.status, that could be the 500, which is internal server error. Then we can use again the JSON. That could be, we can have the message, we can have the error occurred. We don't need to send the error details to the client. So that is like the error occurred, and that's it for now. So wanna try that? Yes, so let's try it. So here we have API v1 products, and that's a GET request. So we don't be needing any body. So once we hit on the send, so now you can see we saw something. Right now we are seeing some data. We have the products. So inside that we have the array of the products. So the first parameter is empty array, because now that is the empty array that contains the entire product data, right? So we wanna move on to queries, and we wanna send the very first thing. Then we can use the result zero property with that. And if we again click on the send, again, I think we have something. So, so these are the details that we are getting. And then you can see there are some extra details as well, which we will cover later, which we'll fix later. So you can see that's how everything works, and we can remove the result property from here as well. And another thing that you can do, so you can grab, so we will check this later. So we can remove this log result as well. Now let's create another query, right? Let's create another query. Another query that we want to do would be similar to that. So we can copy and we can have the paste, and in there we can have select star from products. Then we can have the where clause. So we can have the where, then we can have the ID equals to the ID that we'll get, right? So here in this, what we should use? So we should use the question mark. So here we'll be providing the dynamic parameter of the ID. So that's why we can use the question mark, and that is a find by we can have the ID. And after that, we have the query, and inside the second parameter, we can provide the values. We can provide the values in an array. So we can have the array, and in there we can have the ID that we receive from the function. So it like we have the question marks on sequential basis. So if you provide the first question mark, so the array value should be the first one, right? So that's how it works. So it means now we are finding one record by its ID, but as of now, we don't have any record inside this table to display. So let's move on to next thing, which is a create. So let's copy and let's paste it out over there. So that should be a create, right? That should be the create. And in there, now we need the details. We need the title, we need the description, then we need the price. So these are the details that we need, right? Now inside that, now we want to provide the details. So now the query would look different. So we should use the backticks with that. So we can have the insert into, so the table name is we have the products, right? So we can have the products like that. And then what should we do as the next step? Now we can provide the details, like we need to insert the title, description, and we need to insert the price. So this is the normal SQL syntax for inserting the database, for getting the record from the database. And that is no, like it is not related to Node.js, it is related to SQL. So if you don't have, like, if you don't know about these queries, so you can refer to SQL basic queries and you will get that. So now we have the insert into products. So we'll be inserting these three products, and then we can have the values as well. So we can have the values like that. So the values could be there. We can have the question mark, then again we can have the question mark, then again we can have the question mark with that. So insert into products. So the title, description, and the price. So this for the title, this for the description, and this for the price. So here we have the query, and in there we have this ID over there. So instead of this, we should provide the title, we should provide the description, and we should provide the price property with that. And that's how it works, right? That's how it works. And now we'll be just sharing you the result, and you can see that's how it works. And we want to customize the log message as well. So we have the find by ID, right? And here we can have our error occurred while creating new record. So we should provide this error message as well. And let's try the create operation now, and let's see what happens, right? So let's move on to, we can move on to handlers. So we can move on to create. So first thing that we want to do is we want to grab the details, like we can grab some details from the request.body, right? From the request.body, we can grab some details. So details that we want to grab would be the title of the product, right? The description of the product, right? Then we can have the price of the product, right? We can have the title, description, and the price that we'll be grabbing from the request.body. And then we can check a validation as well. If we don't have the title, or if we don't have the description, right? Sorry, if we don't have the description or if we don't have the price. So that is a very basic condition check. So you should have more like a reliable approach for validating the user input. So for validating the user input, so here I'm using this. Then we can send the return response dot. We can have the JSON. That could be message. We can have the input parameters were not provided, something like that, right? So we can have the status as well. And that should be the 403, something like that for the forbidden. Now after that, now what should we do after this if checked? Now let's move on. And here we can just have like const. We can have the product, something like that. That should be equals to a weight. Then we can have the create product. Sorry, we have the queries. So we have the create. So we can have the create only. We have the create. And in there, we can provide the title over there, right? We have the title. Then we can have the description over there. Then we can move on. Then we can have the price. And that's it. Now we would be getting the result. So we can just move on. We can have the return response start. We have the status. That should be 201, which is created. Then we can have the JSON over there. We can have the message. That should be equals to, I think we don't need to provide the message. We can only provide the normal product which was created. And another thing, so we have missed the try catch block. So we can have the try catch as well. So the try catch can have when performing the DB operations. And if we get any error, then we can just use the same return error message like that, right? So that is the create product for our application. So first we would be getting the details from the request.body. Then we can have the if check for checking if the title, description or the price is not provided or is it empty. Then we can have the try catch for creating a new product. So let's see what happens over there. So let's create another request. URL would be same, I think. We have the products slash we can have the create. And in there, we should use the post. We can have the raw. We can have something like we can have the JSON. And in there, let's move on. And here, suppose what we want to do. So we can have the title. That should be equals to, we can have, suppose that should be, we can have the iPhone, something like that. Then we can have the iPhone, suppose 15. Then we can have the description. We can have the description like that. And that could be the latest iPhone from Apple, something like that. Then we can have the price similar to that. We can have the price. The price could be somewhat similar to around like 70,000 something. We can have the price for that. So these are the details that we are sending to the server, right? The title, description and the price. And let me get back to queries. Description spelling should be same. The price should be same. And let's see what happens. So if we hit on the send, so you can see now we are seeing the status of 201, which is created. And another thing you can see now we are receiving the inserted ID and the affected rows as well, right? We are receiving the inserted ID and the affected rows. It means everything is working perfectly fine. And if we again move on to Docker, if we check if we have the records inside our table, so we can have the select star from, that should be equals to we have the products, right? Select star from products. And there you can see now we have one record inside our database, right? Now we have one record inside our database. And if you want to use the API, you can also use the API as well. So let me get back. And if we hit on the send, you can see now inside the first parameter of the array, then we have the first parameter and we are receiving the array. So if we move on to queries, so let's optimize that. So we only need to send the first parameter, right? We only need to send the first parameter. So if we again try that out, if we hit on send, you can see now we are receiving the products array. we are having the array over there, and inside that we can have multiple products. And if we create another product, that could be, suppose we have like AC or something like that, we have the split AC, then we can have the LGAC, something like that. Then we can have price of suppose 30,000. And if we hit on the send, you can see now affected rows equals to 1 and the inserted ID is equals to 2. And if we check that here, so then we would be receiving two records from there, the ID 1, the ID 2 of the split AC, and you can see that's working perfectly fine. And let's test this route as well. So get by ID. So we have to test this route as well, like get product by ID. So let's test it out. So let's complete the get by ID as well, and let's quickly wrap up this project. So here now what we should do. So we should have a normal try catch statement like any other function. So we can just copy and we can just paste it out here. So here we'll be having the product instead of product. So we have the product over there, that could be equals to, we can have the find by ID and we would be providing the ID. But if we move on to routes index.js, you can see we are having the dynamic ID. But how we can grab this ID? So the big question is how we can grab this ID. So the answer would be it would be very simple thing to do. So here inside the URL, so we are having the params, right? We are having the params inside the URL. So we can use the request object. So inside the request object, we also have a params property with the express, which gives us like, you can see if we move on again to index.js routes, so whatever we define with the colon becomes a param with the express. And same with the update. So after this update, if we provide this ID, it becomes a param. So this param, so we can get this param with the request.params object. So inside the request.params object, if we have declared a param like this, like the ID, then we can grab this with using the request.params.id. So the param name should be same. And if we are providing here, suppose the PID, like the product ID, then it should be the product ID. So that's how it works. So we can use the request.params dot the variable name, which is the ID. So let's move on again inside the handlers. So here let's grab the ID. So we can have the const ID that should be equals to request dot we have the params dot we can have the ID. And inside the find by ID, now we would need to provide the ID inside that. That should be the ID. And in there, the response route status 200 and the product that we want to provide would be the product itself. And inside the queries, make sure you have the result 0 property of the array to grab the result. Right? That was very simple. And let's try it out. So we have the get all products. So if we get the product by ID 1, right? If we have the ID by 1, you can see now we would be only be getting the first parameter, which is the ID. And you can see that's how it works. And if we have the 2, it means now we would only be getting the second parameter with that. So you can see that's how it works, right? That's how it works. And let's quickly jump on to upgrade as well. So here we should have the update product as well inside the queries. So we have the create, we have the find by ID, and we have the find as well. So let's have update as well. We can copy the create and we can paste it on the update as well. We have the update. And inside the update, now what we should do. So again, we can grab similar properties, but here we have to update the data. Instead of using the insert, here we have to update. And how we can grab the update. So if you're not familiar with the SQL queries, you can anytime move on to Google. You can just search for something like SQL update statements or anything with that. Like you can see the SQL update. You can have the update column name. You can have the insert as well, select as well. So that's how it works, right? And if we use the update, we just need to provide the update, the table name, set values of columns, and provide the condition where you want to update that. So the query would be we can have the update products like that, right? We have the update products. And in there, what should we do? So we can have the set. And inside the set, you can see what do we have? We have the column 1 equals to value, column 2 equals to value like that. So we have to remove that, and there we have the set. And in there, we can just have the title that should be equals to the question mark again. We can have the description that should be equals to question mark, price equals to question mark, right? And now we want to provide like where we want to update that, right? Now we want to provide that where we have to update the record. So we can have the where clause as well. So we can have the where the ID equals to the question mark. So we should also get the ID as well. So which product we want to update, we should grab this ID. So we can have where ID equals to this ID. And now we have the client.query. We have the title, description, price. We can have the ID as well, right? We can have the ID, and that's how it works, right? That was a basic condition. The title, description, and price will be updated where the ID equals to the provided ID, right? So now we would need to have the zero property with that, and that's it, right? That's it. So if we again try that out, if we move on to handlers, so we can have the update, the product. So we can just have some things like we can just copy this, create one. We can move on to update. We can have the request.body. We can get the ID as well. The ID should be equals to request.params. We can have the ID like that. And inside that, what should we do? So we would need to provide the params validation. So we can have a wait, that should be we can have the update. And inside the update, we can provide the ID as the fourth parameter, right? That's how it works. And if we just save, and if we just check if the server is open or not. So if we move on, we have the server open. So let's have the update as well. Let's copy that. Let's move on to this. Let's have the update post over there. Sorry, we can have the put post over there. That should be the put. And in there now, what should we do? So we can just have like the API v1 products slash we have the update like that slash we can have the ID of 1. So we want to upgrade the first product. So we can provide some title and a description. So suppose we just copy this and we just move on and we just paste this here, right? So the title could be we can have iPhone 15, then we can have something like 64 GB, something like that. So we can have iPhone 15, then we can have like Apple has announced latest iPhone, something like that. Then we can have price of something around, we can have 1 lakh, right? So what if we update the details? If we hit on send, so you can see now the affected rows equals to 1. You can see the rows match changed 1, and you can see the changed rows equals to 1. And if we just get all of the products now, if we just get the first product only, if we hit on the send, you can see the iPhone 15 64 GB. 64 GB, we have the Apple announced the latest iPhone, and you can see everything is working perfectly fine. And the final thing could be very simple. So what should we do? So we can move on to again the queries. So here, let me move on, and here we have the update. So the final delete query would be very simple, very simple. So here we have the delete, and in there we do not need any parameter. Sorry, we have the delete product, something like that. So we have the delete record. So we can have the delete record because the name was conflicting with the JavaScript delete keyword. So here we do not need anything, we just need the ID, and that's it. So the query would be delete from, we can have the products, then we can have the condition, right? Like you can see we can have the normal condition where ID equals to this ID. and that's it. So we can have the details, like we can just remove all these things. We just have the ID, and inside the handlers, we have the delete product. Let's move on. Let's just copy all these things again. The try catch block, right? Let's copy the try catch block over there. So we can have the const product. Await, that should be, we can have the delete record, and in there we just need to provide the ID. So we can grab the ID. Again, we can have the request dot, we have the params dot, we can have the ID like that. We have the delete record, then we can have the ID. And that's it, Rao. That's it. Now you can see that's it. The status should be 200 instead of 201. Here as well, it should be 200 instead of 201. And everything is working perfectly fine. That's it. So let's see if the product is being deleted or not. Let's move on. So we can have this same URL. Let's delete the first product from our database. Let's delete, like we have the product, we have the delete. Let's delete the first product. Let's see what happens. The request would be the delete. So if we hit on the send, you can see the affected rows equals to 1. You can see affected rows. So our status 2, you can see the status is 200. And if we just get all of the products from the database, if we get all the products, we only have the second record inside the database, right? So you can see we have successfully created a CRUD API with using the SQL, and with using the Node.js, with using the Docker image of the SQL. You can grab the records from here as well. If they select star from products, you can see we only have one record. And you can see another thing that I want to show you. Suppose if we just remove that, and if we just delete this container, you can see if we delete this container, suppose we run the container again with using this command. If we run that again, if we move on, if we have this, and you can see now the container ID is there. And you can see still, if you move on to execute, like MySQL, the user, that is the root, password is, we can have the test, and we can have the use ecom, something like that. So you can see the ecom table is still there. Then we can have the show table, something like that. You can see we still have the table of the products even when the container was down. So you can see with the help of the volumes, we have achieved that. And you can see if we move on, and if we again move on and have, we can select star from we can have products. So then we would be grabbing the details. So you can see these are the details, and everything seems to be working perfectly fine with that. You can see everything is working perfectly fine. Now we have the details of the products as well. So you can see now we have completed this project. So it was a great learning experience for you, right? Now you know that how you can work with the SQL databases, with using the Docker, with using the Node.js, and you can see everything is working perfectly fine. So that's how you can work with the MySQL package with using the Node.js, and that's how you create the CRUD API, the REST API with using the Node.js, the SQL, with using the Express.js and error handling as well. So that's it from our side. And if you need any help, if you have any doubts, you can just let us know inside the comments. So stay tuned for the next video on the Node.js or any other topic as well. So that's it. My name is Nikhil. I will see you inside the next video.